All right, welcome everybody. It's February 8th, and we're doing it again. Another Antelope Node Operator Roundtable discussion. We'll kick things off if Steven's available to share any news, if there is any, on software progress on the Antelope side of things. Any releases or things to look out for.
Absolutely, yeah. So no big updates for this week, but I think that in the next week or so, we'll start communications around sort of a anticipated code freeze date across the next month or so, and just starting to have more broad discussions here about release readiness. I think some of the models that we had in the past, kind of working with some of the select group, was really beneficial. So may start collaborating a little bit more across these next couple of weeks in that direction, but steady as we go.
Beautiful. Still, I think March was the target for 4.0 last time. From the last update, that's still roughly in the same ballpark.
Yep, we live in the realm of kind of that March-April timeline that we've communicated, and that's what we should be zeroing in on in these next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you. Any questions or comments on that?
And that means moving to jungle at that time. That doesn't mean going to the block producers. It means it starts to soak on jungle towards the end of March, maybe early April.
Right.
And then after it's soaked a while and there might be some, fixes to it, then it would be release candidate for the block producers.
Anyone out there worried about a consensus upgrade? This is not going to be a consensus upgrade, so anybody can update as they wish, when they wish, and there's no risk of getting forked out of the network like the last big consensus upgrade.
I think
all right.
What we've determined we want to do, and there of course will always be an exception as soon as you make a rule, but the goal will be that the consensus upgrades will be in September and in September only. Obviously, if something just absolutely is backbreaking, we would have to discuss that at the leadership team and the ENF. But the goal is the March releases are not consensus upgrades, and the September releases, if they're needed, and we believe each September will need a consensus upgrade, and that is the goal.
Well, can I just say, love how easy you make the lives for our node operators in this network. We've been experiencing life in some of the other blockchains, and it's much less planned and stable, and there's always new upgrades breaking things every other day. Matthew can probably attest to how difficult life is for node operators in some of the other chains. So shout out to the ENF and OCI and all the hard work you guys are doing, and doing nice and well organized here with these releases.
Clearly isn't me. It has to be the rest of the team. Thank you.
I saw there was a question about would it launch a Jungle 5. I would assume no. The only reason we really had to launch Jungle 4 was because we had gone down the 2.1 protocol path. So unless we break Jungle, which we'll try.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Jungle also upgrades because of other reasons. But yes, there will likely be a Jungle 5 at some point in the future.
Correct. Not because we're a protocol type here. Yes, we try to break it to see what it can handle, but which is why, hey, we're okay with relaunching it when we do it. But no, I don't. This would not include any foreseen plans to relaunch to a Jungle 5. So let's burn it. All
right. Unless there's any other or questions or comments on that, I think we can hand it over to Brian to talk about special purpose nodes.
Yes. So, just as I feel a sneeze coming on, but I'm just going to talk through it and see what happens. What could go wrong? Yeah. So we had talked before about how, there's just Node EOS, right? But in practice, that one thing, Node EOS, is run with different configurations for different purposes, like on blockchain networks. But that the configurations that you would use for each of those different purposes is not comprehensively documented, and more just kind of is, I guess you could call it, tacit knowledge or something that is shared by block producers who are working the space, or node operators, I should say, who are working in the space. And so we talked about how that is actually the root of some of the issues that we ran into last week, or rather not ran into, that we were talking about last week, because you might best practices for running a node might say that, like, hey, this shouldn't even be on for this node, those sorts of things. Right? So with that in mind, what we decided to do was I took a stab at documenting what I think, based on the conversation and my notes from it, what I think the different roles that nodes might play. And I've, shared that in the Antelope Node Operator chat area, as well as a few other spaces on Telegram, to get feedback. And a few folks have been kind enough to jump in there and start providing some feedback proactively before this meeting. But what I want to do now is go through that list and sort of in real time solicit feedback from you folks, so that we can try to come to consensus on first, what are the different types of nodes and the roles they play, and then the best practices as far as configuration for each of those types. From there, I think a first step, once we have best practices written down, a first step will be to draft just documentation that we can publish that will make this a tangible artifact of shared knowledge. And then we can also explore other options of, like, how we might use that knowledge, such as one idea we discussed was actually adding new flags, if you will, on Node.EOS to have default configuration settings, or even maybe special purpose executables if it made sense to do so and was feasible. So with that sort of context, I shared the link to this document, and it looks like Daniel's also sharing the document on his screen, which should be up for everyone in Zoom and on the recording. So there's two sections to this document. This is obviously a very informal, quick, it's intended to be something we can align on, not a beautiful piece of documentation. But there's two sections. There's node traits and node types. The meat of this is actually node types. Second section is where I'm actually driving towards. Like, I want the types documented and like I said, best practices for configuration. The traits, I think we can jump back to if we find it helpful. Those are just things that I was keeping in mind as, like, variables, if you will, that might be relevant to a node's role in the network. So let's jump to node types, Daniel. Sure. So I'm just going to go through these one by one, and if there's any disagreement that it even is a type of node that is worth documenting, then speak up, please. You can either unmute and say so, or just send something in chat. I'll watch the chat. And then also I'll ask for input on important descriptive information on it. We won't try to polish that and get it perfect yet. And then best practice sort of configuration, like how you would configure this, if that makes sense. So first up, I think is maybe the most obvious one, which is a block producer node. What I said about it is organizes transactions into blocks to be added to the chain subject to consensus mechanisms. Any feedback on this one?
I mean, it from a public side, it's important to keep it as isolated from trash as possible, because when it has to deal with trash, it can't do what it needs to do. So it's always kind of hanging off in la la land.
And by trash, I'm assuming you mean things like transactions that aren't going to successfully execute, or like, what else might you mean?
I don't know. I mean, all sorts of interesting, fun things that people have come up with. But yeah, like a bunch of failed transactions, which, is from the subjective billing, which helps it not have to deal with things it knows, but you have to filter that through several nodes to kind of provide that accepting of transactions. But like I accidentally hooked up with Matthew's relay only type of nodes and couldn't get pending transactions in. So it's a very delicate kind of, you got to keep it isolated, but you also got to make sure you can get the pending transactions in. So it's just unique in the fact that it really hangs off behind a bunch of filters. While a lot of us have that P2P Sentry, whatever. Anyway, just an interesting, that's a specialty of that node. And there may be multiple ones because, to get a backup, you need some sort of mechanism. Matthew, I don't know, what do you think?
I was just going to say, you're also isolating it from general TCP, UDP, internet, weird traffic.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Public trash.
Yeah, exactly. So just gentle internet abuse. Trying to keep it isolated. So, if you're being really cautious, your Sentry node and your BP node are on. Yeah, build a sense of isolation as you go across more firewalls, more things. So, you also have to think about your signing key. I'm not sure how many people put it on a hardware thing. Probably not many. But if you're thinking about, about this actual key here to sign a blocks on and how you manage it. So you want to physically separate it as well, not just like a containerized machine, potentially. Or maybe in a separate rack with a separate physical key to, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah, everybody does that.
Yeah, exactly. We don't put it in separate racks with separate physical. No. It's on separate machine. But right, as far as we go. I think I had this conversation with Bart at one point. What? You don't need physical hardware? Keep this. Yeah.
So then, I guess, are there other, really this is almost like desired traits or something like that, right? Are there other sort of desired traits of a block producer node?
You tend to run the HTTP API because we have to for get block and health and statistics. But obviously, it's kind of serving up a lot of the stuff that you don't want to be accessible, even to yourself. But it's rolled in. So, we've talked about that get info being separate. The only reason to run that is because you need the help info. Really, that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you say HTTP API? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, the web API, HTTP.
Yeah. So there's like a.
You need to enable it.
You need get info, so you need to run the HTTP API for monitoring, but you need to prevent public access to it, right?
Correct. If it didn't listen on a web port, a lot of that gets alleviated. So, we just kill it at the proxy or whatever, but ultimately you're having to always go a second step above to lock the hell out of the API. But you want it to run, and if it's in a cloud, kind of need public access to it to monitor it. We just lock it down because we're all internal network.
So I guess it'd be open public access, right? So you run it. So is this right as a configuration best practice? Run HTTP API for local network monitoring access, but prevent open public access.
Well, you probably want to, if you have a private network, a lot of abuse, if you read research, comes from your own internal users doing weird things. So you really want to lock it down in general, right?
Yeah, it's running a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't need to. But
Yeah.
so you end up protecting it and locking it down and securing it when really, and like I say, it's kind of that other little bucket about the get info. That's the only reason we even run it. And a lot of people don't run it because we tell them don't run it as a public web server. Okay, run it size blocks perfectly fine without the web, but good luck. You have to monitor some other way of is this thing working?
The other thing
Hey, guys.
on is like producer API, so you can change blocklists or do other interesting banning of users while the
And create snapshots. You don't really want to do that on the
so,
C, but it's
exactly, you don't want to create snapshots, right? But that's enabled with that API,
correct.
right? So the API is not granular enough to allow you to turn the things on you need, but turn off the things that might cause problems.
What you got, Ross?
So I missed the last meeting because I was away. I suppose we also just need to define, unless you guys are already done, exactly what the purpose of this document is, because we're starting to go down a bit of a rabbit hole here. There's lots of things that we can talk about that the block producer is desirable, including, fast single core performance, not too many peers configured, etc., etc. Is this just a general anything we want to add, or is it more focused on the?
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah.
Configuration.
Yeah. Let me be try to clarify. So the intention is not sort of like requirements gathering. You'll note that I am grabbing a couple of things for my own purposes as I hear them, but the purpose is not requirements gathering so much as documenting what is already true about the best practices that node operators are following for these different types of nodes. To try and take it from sort of, tacit knowledge to something concrete that we can document. Does that make sense?
I like it. Yeah, it does.
So comments about peer-to-peer is, really important.
I was also just going to chime in and say, related to that, we'll be working with the developer relations team to actually flesh out these roles inside of our support materials as well over time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't know why I was thinking that we were trying to do some kind of easy configuration to make a node its own kind of standalone node type. That's what I thought it was.
That's how it started. But I think they realized as they started going down all the different mutations of API or ship or peer-to-peer, that they realized, ooh, hell, they didn't even know all of them truly existed. And then yes, we all take it for granted, but it's a valid point. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes. But I think they want that info, that we do need to keep it somewhat isolated.
Yeah. So you can think, Ross, you could think of this as just a necessary first step that could maybe lead to future things like that, but is valuable in its own right, if that makes sense.
I think it's really valuable. It's good to have this kind of information written down somewhere.
Oops. So
I love it. The lessons we've learned over the past 4 or 5 years, and they're finally listening and taking it into account.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, just picking up on Ross's point about peer-to-peers, is like sometimes we notice that like a block producer is not having enough transactions in a block, and you're like, why is it low? And the initial thought process is we need to add more peers. Well, actually, you need to remove peers.
Correct.
Because you're overloading the block producer with too many incoming transactions in too many locations. So this is like a counterintuitive configuration parameter when it comes to peering. Just peer to get the connectivity without generating microcomas, but don't put this.
Yeah.
So what?
Go ahead.
What specific sort of configuration setting would you make to do that? Like, are you
specific one other than I guess what? No, I guess there's nothing really specific.
I'm flipping them in and out of. I've got my full nodes with full logs that I isolate down during a sync, and then I keep 3 to 5 on is what I try to keep. Now I use a lot of my internal Sentry nodes as those internal peers, some of which are relaying public transactions, some are pending
Yeah, that's an
transactions
interesting
from
question. Do the block producers directly peer with other external nodes, or are they only peering with local nodes that are in turn peering with?
I'm gonna say a real world, not you shouldn't be direct because you have no way of subjective billing until it hits the BP. That makes sense. I mean, that's why that layer of P2P in front is it's just incoming with pending, and you can smash in transactions via peer to peer. You know, I mean, it's not difficult, but
sometimes we've got bad handover between nodes on different sides of the world. So you make a call to your neighbor, and sometimes there are direct peer connections.
Greg, that's the 5 that I typically have are my 3 internal peer-to-peers that have their dedicated roles that have scattered or private. But then I tried to have the extra 2, my predecessor and my follower, to assist with that handoff. Because lucky me, EOS Rio and EOS Sphere and I vote for EOS USA always tend to bunch together. So we are bound, and HK, that was another one. We bounce it back and forth across the world a lot because of that brilliant alphabetic scheduling. Anyway.
So did
our
language
practice.
Sorry, I was just asking. So Michael kind of gave an anecdotal on how he configures. How similar is that to how other VPs on the call are configuring?
Yeah, I see Seth is adding a comment there that it doesn't communicate with anything external to my own. Well, ours is the same way. Yeah, I suppose it to anybody else. It's only our own. That way we control everything. You know what's going on. Yeah, sometimes, most of mine is to my own. I have some kind of gateway node. But occasionally I have connected directly to another VP direct.
Yeah, occasionally if you need to for troubleshooting something or
and those 3 to 5, which are a lot of times those internal nodes, kind of have their dedicated roles. For some are kind of off in private, some are getting abused by the public and throttling the hell out of it. You know, I mean, and that's because if you get more than about 5, it really starts to overload the peer-to-peer, just because I think you only talk to 5 concurrent or something, right? I mean,
no. What's also important is to know whether you're sending blocks or transactions, right? When you're relaying it to your next producer or previous producer, you only need the blocks. You don't need to relay any transactions. Yeah.
Yes, but what I got burned on is that when it's a blocks only relay, that's great on the outbound, but I got burned that I had no inbound.
Well,
I was only getting committed transactions. So yes, you need to have relay blocks, but I accidentally backed myself into a corner because peer-to-peers weren't working and all of this and the other, is that I ended up receiving only blocks. Well, as a BP, so that's why I need a blocks only relay, more so on the outbound in my opinion, and inbound just to make sure you're not forking people out, but more so being able to also have one that's accepting the trashiest of transaction and peer-to-peers, right? A lot of non-subjective build, or passing transactions that have already been subjective build that make sure to more make it through. And then, of course, a blocks only relay, which I can't push any transactions through it. So there's 3. That's my main 3. And then, like I say, I've got my extra 2 that kind of bounce around. It allows me to have those kind of 3 segmentations. Matthew has many more. I think he has 5 or 7 role designations.
Yeah, could you list those again for me real quick? I'm sorry. So it was blocks only relay was the last one you said.
Correct. And then I'll start with the first one, which is like a public peer-to-peer, you know.
So it's like an receiving inbound trans.
It is absolutely getting smashed and subjectively billing the hell out of everything before it relays it across, right? It has to be the more open door, but it starts to subjectively bill and then relays what it can through.
And is that
second one,
public peer-to-peer the one you're referring to as your Sentry node?
all three of them are kind of my Sentry level, but I mean, that's the three roles of the Sentry, so to say.
Yeah.
So the P2P really takes much more abuse. The second one in the middle is not, it kind of assumes that things are more already subjectively billed, but allows pending transactions to come through, right? It's kind of a secondary in the middle of, I'm not getting smashed with as much, but I'm still allowing pending transactions through to make it through to my BP. Because the third one tends to be a relay only to make sure, good blocks come in and good blocks go out as quickly and smoothly as they can. But obviously it's isolated from all public because I don't need to ingest, but it's also how I kind of rely on it to make sure, like my ship nodes and snapshot nodes and things like that. You'll notice that purple line there is more, that's what that third one's for, because it only really needs static data. But if you don't have the three, you kind of don't get, you don't really get a good mix of the three. When your publics just get smashed, you get no pending transactions through. So you need another hole to sneak more transaction through to your BP when your public one is busy just subjectively billing. Does that make sense? And then the third one is more, when the BPs come to a consensus, make sure there's always a pipe in and out.
Yeah. Conceptually, it makes sense, but I want to make sure I actually follow because there's a part that I think I still have a gap in understanding on here. So you're saying, obviously, the blocks only relay, and then the public peer-to-peer node, which is often basically subjective billing is expensive because it has to check every single transaction and execute, basically, right? So often that could potentially start running behind or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I didn't understand is how the third node,
the middle one, think of my API calls, right? I had my BP claims that weren't making it to the chain because I was smashing them into my public API and they just got forked out in La La Land or expired or whatever. And so there's this classification of okay traffic, pending transactions, pending blocks coming in from, wherever else ever P2P, but it's not the public ones that just got, the nodes got so slaughtered that things can't go through. So I have the ability for all three different types of traffic. This is where most of the world comes in through. This is another more kind of, I don't open it to public abuse, but it has to allow ending transactions, speculative transactions through to make it through to the VP, both mine and other. The block producer before me didn't finish the queue, therefore I need to get both the queue and the block and then pick up where he left off. That only comes in through that second one in a lot of cases. Make sense? It doesn't always come in through the front.
Would it's a name like preferred peer-to-peer or something make sense? It's
already subjectively billed, right? Peer-to-peer too. That middle one in the middle doesn't normally spend as much time subjectively billing, but it is allowing pending transactions through to the back-end mesh and where I relay my stuff to make sure it gets relayed to the damn block producer.
And you said several times in the middle. What do you mean by in the middle?
I just look at them on a range. Like you look at the three there. There's peer-to-peer 1, 2, and 3. 3 to me is always the private one that isn't, it's in sync, but it's not going to accept any transactions. Peer-to-peer 2 is the one in the middle that internally I need to make sure, and it has much more, curated connections. And then peer-to-peer 1 is, you smash shit into my public APIs or my public peer-to-peer. It'll try to work its way through, but, ultimately it tends to get overloaded. Therefore, the other two are much more critical. I've got one for pending transactions and one for blocks only, which are 2 and 3. The brown ones and the purple ones there.
Yeah.
Give you color. And of course, there's BPs and snapshot nodes and all of that. But this was in a conversation trying to figure out why I was getting empty blocks. With that setup right there, I still get 0 transaction blocks. We aren't quite sure why.
Is this?
Sorry to hijack it, but
No, it's good.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and ask, just curious to know if this is a shared pattern for others. I mean, it seems like there's some pretty clear hierarchy. Any other perspectives?
I learned it from Matthew, I think.
Yeah, similar, but not exactly the same. But yeah. We understand.
Similar enough that this would make sense to document, or are the differences in how you do it worth noting?
We have a local LAN, so it's a little bit different for me. You know, I mean, it also helps me really isolate my public chat. If all of my nodes are talking to peer-to-peer, I mean, I'm smashing 150 megabit worth of peer-to-peer traffic out. But this really allows me to cut down on that 5 megabit per node that they can rack up syncing.
This is maybe not quite on topic of what Brian's trying to talk about here, but I don't mind just to ask why your ship nodes is connected to all 3 PPs as opposed to just one at all.
It would be mostly on 2 and 3, although I just make sure that when 2 goes offline, I still have 3, you know, it's as much redundancy for me. But yes, you can tell I lean more my ship nodes and snapshots and diffuse is about to fill up the bottom line there. But it's really just so I have a consistent mesh of 3 peers in my network. So if one goes off, like I got one down right now, we're not in an EOS USA coma. I also have 2 fiber connections, so I really try to keep one on one gateway and one on the other. So it helps me keep from slipping into a coma as bad. Because
yeah, just in general, there's no reason to send transactions to your ship node, you know, so if you can avoid that, it lessens the load.
Correct. I tend to use it as a backup node because I've got my third API is my primary internal, because my front 2 just get smashed. I can't even get a connection through them. But ultimately, my ship does sometimes. And it also can tend to get set as the node for a backend service. Like Hyperion, by default, wants to latch on to the node that is kind of configured to look at. You can configure it to say, no. Whenever you forward a chain request, forward it to a different server or a push request. But by default, some things really would latch on to, I got one connection to Node OS. And I assume it's the ship server and the web server. And if you push transactions in, hey, remember, these are console logging. They're looking for those transactions to hit the console logs and ship and then be processed out type of thing. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. I think we could probably spend the whole session on block producer nodes, but I'm going to move on to the next one for now. And I can, asynchronously sort of follow up with folks to fill in the details, and get more specific on some of the configuration stuff. So next up is block relay nodes. So, receives blocks from its peers and passes them onward to the rest of its peers after validating block headers. Is that an accurate description of what a block relay node does?
I think so, yeah.
It's kind of what we just really spent a lot of time talking about, I think, in those exactly right there, those 3.
Now, are there any sort of specific configuration best practices for these?
Ooh, Matthew.
Well, just don't make sure you're not accepting peer-to-peer transactions. That's the main.
Accept peer-to-peer transactions.
Or API transactions.
Or what?
Or API transactions.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like parameters that you launch it and say, hey, I know you're running, but just forget about speculative, right? It really just kind of, and it's controlled via both protocols, but you basically kind of flip it into a read-only tile and it only relays what a block producer has smashed into a block, which is great if you're just reading and okay with.
So what about speaking of only block producers? Is there some
That's the third one for me. That's that third hook that make sure you have a path in that's clean and out that's clean. That's a block relay. And basically it's just saying, hey, look, no matter who you're connected to, for the love of God, don't accept speculative. Just relay blocks. And it's much smoother. So it works.
And then as far as peers, does it matter what peers you configure for this?
Only because when you get above about 10 or 15, it really starts to become ineffective, in my opinion. You know, I mean, it's just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. So I tend to try to keep them between 10 and 15. Matthew, would you agree?
I don't know. I didn't count how many we have.
He also publishes his read-only relay nodes.
Yeah, so
there's some of them.
Yeah, it's publicly available, so anybody can connect. So it's not, since the load is not that much, it's available.
Yeah.
I have to check how many. But yeah.
I tend to either pick good trusted BPs that I know, and maybe have solid peer-to-peers, or some of the public, private, some of us just run. We don't broadcast it, but it's still kind of publicly accessible, maybe IP filtered, things like that. But that's do the best job you can.
So since the traffic is low, I just want to make sure I heard what Matthew was saying accurately. Since the traffic is low, this can be public as far as like what you accept, because the header validation is quick. Is my understanding this right?
Yes.
Okay.
But it's public, but not that public, shall we say.
Yeah. Okay. What do you mean by that? Is it just that?
Right. The one that's advertised in the bp.json file is the, smash everything, send transaction.
Yeah.
And this one it's public if you happen to know that it's there, so if somebody asks, oh, here it is, right? I'll have to share it. But it's not like listed in a directory anywhere that says, oh, connect here.
This is the node that got me on an island. I didn't realize it was a relay only, block relay only, and it became the only working peer I had in my mesh to my block producer at the time. So I was getting all the blocks, but I would never get any speculative transactions. Does that make sense? And so it was great, but if it was the only one that was working, but his is public, ours is not. I mean, I use it more.
Is there any, bad stuff that happens if you accept arbitrary peer requests?
It always accepts the peers. It just only accepts a new block. That's the only thing it really will ever accept. And
well, the load balancer will limit you to the number of connections for any IP address, right? So you have the normal internet abuse thing. Somebody can just connect, disconnect, throw bad packets at it, whatever.
Right.
And I've seen that.
There's actually there's a load balancer in there that's protecting the peer-to-peer, right? It's not actually.
Kevin, you said that there's no like state table, routing table type thing that can go for like the shortest path, right? So it could be pulling its blocks from a latent connection. From how I understood it, there was no logic to it. It just sort of pulled whatever was first, right?
That's correct.
And because of that, like the question was, if you connect to GAMI peers, can it be bad? Yes, it can, right? If that is where it's pulling and it's a little bit slow latent.
Yeah.
I think we're talking about two different things here. There's a block relay. Are you talking about if I'm syncing and getting blocks? With a block relay, effectively what it does is it receives a block from anywhere, and if it's already received it, it just doesn't do anything with it. But if it hasn't already received that block, then it will apply the block and then forward it on to all of its peers. So the work being done there, if you only have a block relay node, is just updating your state and then, actually just sending the block to all of its connected peers that it knows doesn't already have that block. Now, while it's applying the block itself, it receives that same block from another peer, it won't send it back. So, there's a little bit of optimization there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking more of where it first gets the block, when it first receives it. It wasn't necessarily receiving it from the fastest place, right? Because it's only ever looking at one peer at a time, is when it comes to actually ingesting that first block.
Actually, it's receiving on. So the net plugin is multi-threaded, so it's actually on all connections. If you will.
Okay.
And so wherever the block comes in first, whichever connection that happens to be is the one that it will use in the process.
Okay.
And
Cool.
the block comes in on other connections. Now it'll typically receive it from all of its connections unless it's slow enough that it's actually applied the block and sent it back, to some of its connections before it's received it. Then, that's a situation where then when it receives it from that connection, it'll be, okay, I already have it. And then I put a little blurb in the chat here, and there was a question about it. So let me just talk about that. It's related to this. I mentioned it because we're talking about block relay nodes. So in 3.2 and prior versions of the software, the way block propagation happens is what I just described. It receives a block, it applies it locally to its state, which, if a block has, say, 200 milliseconds worth of transactions within it, it'll take, roughly 200 milliseconds to apply that into its internal state. And it's not until it's actually applied it into its internal state, that 200 milliseconds, that it then forwards the block, because it validated that block at that point, and then forwards it on to all of its peers. What you have in front of you right now is a change that's coming in the next release, which is to speed that up considerably by instead doing a block header validation only be propagating the block. So what will happen in the next release, which I think will affect your needs for running these block only nodes. Now you see how acting, in real life and practice. I'd be curious to see feedback there. But the new behavior is, as a block comes into a node, it'll simply validate that block immediately, actually now, because of another change that's not mentioned here, but it'll immediately stop what it's doing, validate that block header. And if the block header validation is correct, then it'll forward it on. Now that'll happen in microseconds, not in, hundreds, potentially hundreds of milliseconds, because of the applying the block. So it simply does a block header validation and then propagates the block to all of its peers. And actually that all happens off the main thread now, so that it can happen without actually interrupting the main thread at all.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
So that should very much improve block propagation time, and potentially the need for having these dedicated block propagation nodes.
That's it.
All right. Very good. I think I didn't hear any other key configuration best practices for this one. So perhaps we can move to transaction relay node. Okay. Now I guess the first question I'll ask is this a specific enough node type that exists, or does it break down into different types?
It really could break down a lot, but it's the other side of what you just defined above. Make sure you don't accept transactions on those, either peer-to-peer or HTTP. It may be a public peer-to-peer node or have public peers. It may be a public API node or private API node, but it's not the read-only. It's passing around and potentially dealing with subjective billing, right? I mean, that's where a lot of that work kind of happens on those types of nodes. And then the third one below it, I think, is just the combination of the two. Not, obviously, don't accept transactions, but it's designed to pass blocks, and it's designed to ingest speculative traffic in one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not after validating transaction signatures. It's after computing speculative billing.
In my opinion, maybe there's two main types: a read-only type, or kind of this transaction plus the blocks. I mean, yes, it's fine to pass the blocks. That's not really the heavy work or whatever. The main thing is, are you dealing with speculative or not, which is accepting them or just saying, nope, I'm only accepting a block and moving down the road. So typically the third one is the second one, because you're not relaying blocks. Does that make sense?
No, I got lost actually. So hang on. You're saying if you're only accepting, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. You're saying that transaction relay nodes are just relay nodes because they'll also relay blocks. Is that what you're saying?
Is what I found.
Okay.
But there are two roles it's doing, but it's not a lot to send a block, and Kevin just made it a hell of a lot more efficient. So does that kind of make sense? That the combination of the two, you want to do blocks and you want to do spec.
Yeah, we call them transaction relay nodes, but they relay the blocks too. There's no way to not relay the blocks.
Correct. That's, I mean, fundamentally, that ain't the problem. It's the other side of it. Do I deal with speculative? I call it speculative, but there's a lot to go along with. But there's not really a third type of node. I have three types of nodes because my transaction relay nodes are kind of public abuse or internal, already more filtered, but still speculative. And then the third one's always kind of that, oh shit, is the way I look at it, is that for the love of God, keep this chain in sync. Do not let my node go into a damn coma, which is the BP and the ship. And, just keep them in sync. And Kevin may have helped that. At least they won't get out of sync, but you may start struggling if you're really ingesting a lot of trash.
Okay. After.
In our case, I don't want to speak for the other super nerds on this call. And I know we're about to run out of time, although this is always my most favorite topics. It may be a good.
Does this seem
next topic is API?
Yeah. So transaction relay node acts as a block relay node and also accepts transactions from its peers, passing them onward to its peers after validating and applying speculative billing.
And correct. Or any other, it could be blacklisted. Yes, subjective billing. Or blacklisting, or things that you're kind of doing at the, as you start to work your way through to the magic super special wizard behind the curtain, there are certain things that BPs have put into place to try to prevent it earlier in the stream, because the CPU clock cycles of the BP are so critical. Right. But you isolate it too much and you get on an island.
Okay. And then
Go ahead, Ryan.
And then so it could accept transactions from the public via P2P or API, or it could accept transactions only from like preferred peer. I should say like explicitly configured.
It's up to you whether you expose it publicly and, at least in my opinion, who you peer it with. But, that's why there's the public. I don't control it.
It's a curated list of peers, right? So it could be your own internal peers, or it could be your BP.
Yeah.
Then the is public Boolean, yes, which is what Matthew said. I got no control of it. People smash the shit out of it. Or I don't expose mine publicly, therefore it's purely just my curated list that I make sure works like it's supposed to. But that's almost like a Boolean. Well, did you decide to publish it or not? But then there's the,
is it
I accept ending or I don't accept ending.
I see. Okay. and what would determine whether you would do one or the other?
Like you see in mine, I have the need to provide a public API, but not rely on it for processing, and also have a secondary channel. If my public API mesh gets slaughtered, at least still keep in sync with the rest of the chain that's accepting transactions where I see fit to stay synchronized. And then typically that third one that's like, for the love of God, what we had is our private peers that we were peered with were getting trash and sending them down the chain. So I lost my first layer, which was public. I lost my second layer, which was the pending transactions and the blocks. So at least I have that third layer to make sure the blocks get in time, because we forked people out before you. And then obviously I was signing 0 block transactions or low transactions that barely made it through.
Right.
But at least they made it back out. You know, otherwise you just missed the whole round because I couldn't get them back out the pipe. That makes sense?
Yeah. All right. So we are almost at time. So I want to say a couple of things before we before handing it back to Daniel and ending the call. So obviously this is going to be a long running process. It doesn't have to be the the topic every time we have this call until it's done. What I'd propose is that I'll keep trying to make progress asynchronously, and as I have progress worth sharing, I'll propose this as the topic for a given call so that we can update and get new feedback and that sort of thing. One thing that I'm noticing is that it does sound like some of these node types might be well served sort of even further breaking down into specifically what their purpose is. Because what I'm imagining, and this could be sort of a fallacious sort of logic or something, but what I'm imagining conceptually, not literally in practice, is like if we can think of these things as Lego blocks in a way, right? Where there are specific sizes and shapes of Lego blocks, right, that we can define. Then node operators can sort of snap those Lego blocks together to build the system that they need for their purposes, right? And I don't mean literally in the sense that like these are well-defined components that you can deploy as a thing. I just mean at least conceptually we've documented the different sizes and shapes of Lego blocks and what they are called, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, we kind of did BPs and kind of peer-to-peer layer. I would propose maybe the next call is focusing on those next, because that's going to be a whole probably hour conversation of
Sure.
the APIs.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue discussing this. But if there are other more pressing issues, don't hesitate to reach out to Daniel or myself, and we can discuss whether that should be the agenda instead of this, because, like I said, this could potentially take weeks or even months to like really nail.
But I think it's so critical. I mean, y'all are really starting. I mean, we spent years learning it, but like Kevin's like, why would you have a ship node even relay transaction? Well, I mean, sometimes that's your node. You have a dedicated API node, you don't want to. So things like that, but y'all understanding how we do, why we do what we've done, it's so awesome, because that's all we asked for years, right? And now it's at least either getting fixed or taken into design consideration. So,
but I also think it's an opportunity for node operators to learn from each other. And, if a new Antelope chain wants to launch, it'll be a lot easier for them to do that when it comes to that.
Hey, if anybody does want to do that, call up EOS USA. That's what we do. So happy to come help y'all out. But yes, like I say, we've learned a lot of hard lessons. Happy to relay them and excited that people are listening.
What's this? All right, Daniel.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I don't have any other agenda topics right now lined up for next week. So we do want to continue this this conversation on the API nodes next week, perfectly fine by me. But if anything else comes up, like Brian said, let us know in the chat. And thank you. Have a great day, and we'll be posting the recording and summary shortly in the Telegram channel.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Have a great day.
Have a great evening. Cheers.